Hey guys, tonight, we're unrolling a scroll, dipping it in ink, and tying it to a skybound kite as we follow the strange tale of an emperor who tried quite sincerely to send letters to the moon. No, not through rockets or radio waves. Through paper string and the belief that the sky listens if you speak softly enough. The palace is quiet tonight, not heavy with the silence of secrets, but humming like a taut string stretched from one thought to the next. You're standing in a courtyard draped in moonlight, the flagstones still warm from the sun, though the air now carries a breeze with just enough chill to make you think twice about your sleeves. Up above, the moon hangs fat and pale, more pearl than silver, its light filtering between the carved roof tiles and flickering lanterns. And there he is, the emperor. No crown, no fanfare, just a tall figure in robes the color of soot and parchment, holding a paper kite in one hand and a scroll in the other. His eyes are fixed upward, not with the gaze of a stargazer exactly, but with the quiet focus of someone who spent far too many nights asking questions that don't answer back. You probably won't survive the realization that this was a real person once. A ruler, a scholar, a believer in the beautiful logic of paper and string. His name, well, that part shifts with the legend. Some say he ruled a corner of East Asia in the late 10th century. Others argue he was earlier or later or fictional altogether, a literary ghost with ink-stained hands. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing who's watching from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The paper kite he holds is no toy. It's been constructed with meticulous care, bamboo ribs, curved like a musician's bow silk. Paper stretched thin as breath, every corner hand-painted with symbols drawn from celestial maps and forgotten alphabets. A red tassel flutters from its tail, and at the center, tied with gold thread, is the scroll. Sealed, silent. He doesn't say much. He never does during these rituals. You watch as he steps backward to let the wind take the kite, hands raised slightly, not in command, but an invitation. The kite stutters, dances, then lifts. Higher, higher still, until the scroll disappears into shadow. Now, if this were a modern tale, you'd expect satellites or radio signals. But this is not that story. This is about trust, intention, the belief that messages sent with sincerity might reach a place logic doesn't. And historically speaking, it's not as strange as it sounds. One mainstream historical fact: ancient Chinese scholars did in fact use kites for more than play. They were tools used in military signaling, architectural testing, and even metaphysical rituals. One general in the Han Dynasty famously flew a kite over enemy walls to measure distance for tunneling. That's right, kite espionage. But our emperor here wasn't aiming for war. He was aiming for wonder. Now picture this: every month on the night of the full moon, he would repeat the ritual. A new scroll, a new kite, a new question. And no one, not the concubines, not the generals, not even the scribe tasked with logging wind speed and kite altitude, knew exactly what he was asking. You think of all the things one might want to ask the moon. Are you watching us? Do our dreams reach you? Do you remember the first time we looked up and whispered your name? Fringe detail. According to one scroll preserved in a side temple, the emperor once tried to tie a handful of powdered jade to the kite string, believing it might carry lightness of thought more effectively. The string snapped. The kite vanished into cloud. The temple blamed bad timing. The emperor blamed impure ink. Historians still argue whether this emperor's kite rituals were private superstition or proto-scientific experimentation. Some call him the last great mystic of the imperial court. Others say he was just a man desperate for silence to answer back. But you, standing here in the breathless hush of the courtyard, think maybe he was something else, a quiet rebel against the weight of knowing. Someone who thought just maybe that mystery deserved its own delivery system. As the kite disappears into the stars, you notice something strange. The Emperor doesn't look up with expectation. He closes his eyes, not to wish, but to listen. You return the next evening because how could you not? The air is different now, softer, thick with the perfume of plum blossoms and the distant murmur of zithers behind silken screens. You drift again toward the inner courtyard where the moon has thinned just a little. But tonight the kite ceremony is over. The Emperor is sitting beneath a paper lantern shaped like a lotus. His face turned toward the shadows of the eaves, his hands folded. You almost think he's waiting for something, or someone. You take your place along the carved stone balustrade, careful not to disturb the silence, and let your eyes adjust to the dim candlelight cast from the windows of the surrounding chambers. The air smells of ink and rice paste, old paper, and polished cedar. You swear you can still hear the whisper of the kite string brushing against the wind. This is where you begin to learn how it started. Not the kites exactly, but the questions. The Emperor, as a young prince, had grown up in a palace that valued scholarship the way most courts valued bloodlines. His tutors were astronomers, philosophers, even poets who believed numbers could describe longing. You can imagine the boy no more than 7 or 8, tiptoeing into the celestial observatory late at night, tracing constellations with ink-stained fingers, asking the guards impossible questions. Like, does the moon forget, or can light carry memory? One mainstream historical fact in the Tang and Song dynasties, emperors and aristocrats frequently sponsored observatories and engaged in state-sponsored astrology. These weren't simple stargazing hobbies. They were instruments of political guidance used to forecast everything from floods to rebellions. Cosmic patterns meant divine intent. The moon wasn't just scenery, it was strategy. But the Emperor, even as a child, saw it differently. He wanted to write to the sky. According to an aging scroll preserved in a corner tower of the Imperial Archives, a scroll so delicate that monks whisper over it instead of touching it, the boy prince once released a folded poem into the wind. No kite, just paperweight with a stone and coated in fragrant oil. It disappeared into a grove. He called it a test. The next day, a black-feathered bird appeared on his windowsill with a twist of paper in its beak. Different handwriting, different message. The scroll says, the boy didn't tell anyone. Fringe detail many East Asian folktales tell of birds acting as messengers for spirits, particularly magpies and crows. Some traditions even describe birds as temporary vessels for souls seeking to communicate across realms. Of course, whether any such bird actually replied to the boy's offering is, well, debated. Historians still argue whether the Emperor's childhood experiments were early creative writing exercises or glimpses into proto-mysticism. The records are sparse. Some fragments call him the feathered scholar. Others omit him entirely, as though his quiet questions didn't merit political ink. But someone remembered, because decades later, after he took the throne, not by conquest, but succession, he began to rebuild the Imperial Archives with a new wing, one dedicated not to doctrine, but to ephemeral thought. That's what he called it. A place to store letters never meant to be answered. You walk now through the long hall, leading to that forgotten wing. There are no guards, no signs, just 2 dragon-shaped hinges on a lacquered door so smooth it reflects the flicker of your lantern. Inside, shelves bow beneath the weight of scrolls. But these are different. They're unlabeled, untitled. Some are even sealed with wax never opened. You see one tied with crimson silk. It's not shaped like a falling star. Another painted with a single tear. There's no index, no logic, only intention. You pause by a low table, set with brushes and jade inkstones. A candle burns nearby, almost out. Someone has just been here. You realize in that moment that this is not a library. Not exactly. It's a whisper chamber, a confession room for thoughts too light to be shelved, too fragile to be categorized. The kind of thoughts that only the moon might understand. And that's when you find it a folded paper crane tucked beneath a polished bowl of salt water. You recognize the brushstrokes instantly slanted, deliberate, oddly gentle for a ruler's hand. Inside, a short message. To what height must one ascend before gravity lets go? You exhale. Lucius would have copied it into his notebook. Right between the salt experiments and the page labeled Resonance doesn't require sound. Because here again is a kindred spirit. The Emperor didn't want dominance. He wanted dialogue, not to command the heavens, but to ask if they ever wanted to reply. The night grows colder. You wrap your robe tighter and return to the courtyard where a fresh kite lies waiting on the stone bench. This one's different, smaller, its tail woven from threads dyed silver and blue. You lift it gently and find that a scroll has already been tied to its spine, not from you, but from him, the Emperor. You glance up. He's nowhere to be seen. Only the moon remains still silent and slightly tilted, as though listening. You release the kite. The wind answers, and his story continues. The kite rises quickly, too quickly, its silk tail snapping like a secret in the wind. You watch it disappear above the roofline, your fingers tingling from the release. Something about this feels larger than symbolism, more than just gesture. It feels like you're part of a conversation that never uses words. And the Emperor, he's still gone. Or maybe he was never there. What is clear as you make your way back through the quiet walkways of the palace is that this wasn't the only time a kite carried a letter. Not even close. You soon learn that the Emperor didn't keep his sky letters a secret. Not after the first decade of his reign. He made a ritual of it, a ceremony held every third full moon in the western courtyard, just past the perfumed magnolia trees. There beneath banners of silk and tiers of lantern light, he invited poets, priests, astronomers, and even children to write messages to the moon. One mainstream historical fact. In imperial China, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, the moon festivals were deeply symbolic and often tied to acts of poetry, community gatherings, and celestial reverence. While there's no formal record of a kite letter ritual, several obscure folk tales mention emperors and scholars sending offerings skyward, using lanterns or windborne messages. The emperor's version wasn't about offerings. It was about connection. The messages varied from prayers to jokes to confessions scrawled with shaky hands, but all were tied to paper kites and released into the night under strict instruction. Send only what the moon deserves, which raises the question, what does the moon deserve? According to one court poet who wrote anonymously and tucked his verses inside folded plum blossoms, the moon deserves everything we are too afraid to say aloud. Fringe detail one preserved poem from the imperial kite ritual reads, I told the moon of you. She did not reply, but I felt her nod. Historians still argue whether the kite ceremonies were a clever distraction from the emperor's growing political isolation, or a sincere mystical pursuit. It's true that during his later years, he grew more withdrawn from official affairs, but even his harshest critics note that he remained meticulous in managing the palace archives, especially the sky letter wing. And here's where the story turns just a little stranger. Because one night a letter returned, it arrived not by string or courier, but fluttered into the courtyard unannounced. A pale parchment folded into a spiral and sealed with ink that shimmered faintly under moonlight. No messenger, no witness. The message read, You were heard. Try again. This set the court ablaze with rumors. Did it fall from a higher kite, a bird, a celestial body, or was it a prank? The emperor said nothing. But from that day forward, the messages changed. You see it in the preserved scrolls. More deliberate language, clearer script, deeper questions. Instead of, are you watching? They asked, Do you remember me? Instead of, what should I do, they wondered. Did you choose to rise? Or were you pulled? And in the margins of those questions, sometimes, only sometimes, you see faint replies. Not in ink, not exactly, but pressed into the paper as if written with wind or warmth or something else entirely. Lucius would have turned these into a thesis. Displacement by lunar breath, maybe. Or a notes on celestial reciprocity in confined atmospheric rituals. You know how he was. But here in the Emperor's court, there were no experiments, no hypotheses, only ritual and awe. You're shown to a gallery where the paper used in the moon letters was made. It's not just ordinary parchment. It's moonlight paper created under specific conditions. Rice straw soaked in spring water, mulched under a waxing moon, dried over polished obsidian slabs. Each sheet takes weeks to make. It's thin, resilient, and glows faintly when warm. Scribes here believe that the paper remembers touch, that it holds on to the weight of words and releases them again under starlight. You hold one sheet between your fingers, and for a second, you swear it's humming. The scribe watching you doesn't speak. He just nods. Later that evening, you join the others beneath the magnolia trees. A fresh stack of moonlight paper rests on a lacquered table. Ink brushes soak silently beside it. The Emperor is there again, robed in soft indigo hair, bound with a single silver pin. He doesn't address the crowd. He simply writes. When he finishes, he ties his letter to a kite shaped like a dragon scale and releases it into the wind. Others follow, and for a brief, strange moment, the sky looks like it's shedding thoughts. You lean down and begin your own message. But it's hard, isn't it? To know what to say to something you've never met but always felt. The moon has been watching you your whole life, but what do you give her? You write anyway, something short, something real, and when your kite lifts into the dark, you feel not relief exactly, but peace, the kind that follows when you stop needing answers and start loving the questions. As the last kite vanishes over the palace roof, the Emperor glances toward you. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't have to. In his gaze, you read the truth of it. The moon does not need to answer. She just needs to listen. And that's enough. The morning after a moon letter ritual feels like stepping into a quiet garden after a storm. Everything's still, everything waiting. The palace is hushed, but not somber. It's the hush of digestion of minds turning inward, replaying what was released into the sky and wondering perhaps what might come back. You walk the courtyard paths, slowly, sandals brushing dew from the cobblestones. There's a servant collecting stray bits of torn kite string from the hedges. A scribe sits nearby, copying down fragments of remembered letters onto fresh parchment. Some survived only in the minds of those who wrote them. And then, someone tells you the next part of the story. The Emperor had begun recording the moon's replies. Of course, no one else could see them. They didn't arrive as letters or as dreams, not even as voices. But he insisted they were there, folded into the way trees leaned under starlight, and how the tide shifted 3 beats off its usual rhythm in the patterns frost left on the imperial windows. One mainstream historical fact. During the Song dynasty, a number of court records describe emperors engaging in dream divination, interpreting natural omens and astral changes as direct celestial communication. Some emperors even had dream historians, whose job was to write down nightly visions and draw conclusions from them. The Emperor in our tale. He started keeping his own dream log, not written in characters, but drawn. Spirals, lunar arcs, the outlines of fish birds or empty bowls. Each symbol marked a moon phase, an emotional tone, a kind of answer only he understood. And here's where it gets fringe, even for an imperial court, already dabbling in moonlit kite rituals. He commissioned a device, a tall brass instrument, part telescope, part prayer wheel, part absurdly elaborate compass. It stood in the observatory overlooking the eastern garden, always aimed toward the moon's rising point. Its gears turned slowly, powered by wind and weighted pendulums, and when the conditions were just right, it emitted a low hum, almost like breath. The court engineers called it the resonant tracker. It was meant to measure lunar sympathy, a theoretical energy the emperor believed passed between Earth and Moon, especially during kite letter ceremonies. He claimed the device could detect it, not with precision, but with presence. A change in the air, a pause in sound, a quiver in reflection. Historians still argue whether the resonant tracker was a spiritual machine, an elaborate distraction, or simply a misunderstood musical instrument. Some suggest it was never intended to measure anything, but rather to focus attention, a meditative anchor for the emperor's lunar obsession. But others whisper that on certain nights, the tracker spun on its own, unwound, sang. The emperor kept his notes hidden, but a few survived in the journals of a palace attendant who described one night when the tracker hummed low and long, just after the emperor whispered a question into the sky. He didn't speak the question aloud, but the reply apparently came the next morning. A moon-shaped frost ringed the imperial pond. Inside hid a feather, pure white, not from any local bird. You don't get proof, of course, just stories. But stories have gravity, and by now the emperor's gravity is tugging on more than the moon. Poets across the empire begin referencing his rituals. Some write moon letters and launch them from rooftops in secret. Children build tiny kites from rice wrappers and twigs scribble, "I'm sorry," or "tell me something true" onto them, and let them go during harvest festivals. One woman ties a letter to a swallow's leg. The bird returns a week later and lays 3 eggs in her hairbrush. Coincidence, maybe. But then again, what isn't? The emperor never publishes his kite letters, but in time he builds a pavilion, a crescent-shaped hall on the palace's western edge, open to the sky with tables arranged in arcs and cushions sewn with silver thread. This becomes the listening room, and you tonight are sitting inside it. The air smells like sandalwood and old books. You hear the rustle of paper, the flick of brush on parchment, the barely there music of a breeze that never seems to stop moving, even when nothing else does. People write here, not always to the moon, sometimes to lost family or forgotten dreams or versions of themselves they can no longer reach. One man writes to a tree he cut down in his youth. A woman writes to a child she never had. A child writes to the stars, "Please tell me what I'm for." No one answers, but the act of asking changes them. Lucius would have filled an entire scroll in here. He'd ask whether the soul drifts upward or presses inward, whether salt or silence carries memory better, and why certain names make your chest ache like a bruised bell. You look down at your own blank page. What would you write? Not because you expect a reply, but because some thoughts only become real when they leave the body. You write slowly. The ink pools in a shape that looks almost like the moon. And as you finish, something above shifts, just slightly. A cloud moves, the wind hushes, and the resonant tracker perched in the distance gives a single click. It's not much, but it's enough. Because tonight, in this luminous echo of ritual and longing, you understand what the emperor meant. Some messages don't need to arrive. They just need to be released. By now, the emperor's habits are legend, not just among the courtiers and poets, but even among the hawkers in the market, the farmers in the outlying provinces, and the schoolchildren learning to trace moonglyphs in their handwriting drills. Word travels fast when it rides on wonder, and make no mistake, this has become an empire of wonder. You're walking now through one of the emperor's traveling exhibits. Yes, he has those. Open-air displays in villages and cities, meant to educate and inspire. Kites from previous launches hang on lacquered stands, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Some are shaped like stars, others, like turtles' cranes' bells. One is clearly meant to resemble the moon herself. White silk, stretched taut over a bamboo frame painted with eyes. Nearby scrolls under glass record sample letters, each one penned in the emperor's own delicate hand. They're poetic, yes, but not grand. One simply reads, "Do you grow tired of us?" Another, "What do you dream about when you're dark?" The crowd reads in silence. Reverent curious, a child tugs at their parent's sleeve and whispers, "Did the moon write back?" The parent doesn't answer. Maybe they don't know. Maybe the answer is not yet. One mainstream historical fact: during the Tang and Song dynasties, emperors were often seen as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Their rituals weren't mere pageantry. They were cosmological maintenance. Without the emperor's proper behavior, balance might break, crops might fail, the moon might withhold her blessings. That's a lot of pressure, even for someone with a crown. The emperor's response: invite the people in. This part gets overlooked in textbooks, but it's crucial. The moon letters didn't stay a private ritual. Soon after the first few launches, the emperor decreed a new observance, the Night of 1,000 Kites. Held during the full moon closest to the vernal equinox, the festival called upon every household, no matter how small, to craft one kite, write one message, and send it skyward. Participation wasn't mandatory exactly, but let's just say those who did earned favor, and those who didn't found their roof taxes go mysteriously unadjusted. Still, most people joined not from fear, but from joy, because this wasn't like other festivals. There were no fireworks, no lion dances, no fried pastries or juggling monks. This was quieter, reflective. Families gathered in gardens, courtyards, rooftops. They lit small lanterns, read their messages aloud, and let their kites go all at once. The sky would fill with wings and wishes, paper birds soaring through the dark like thoughts given form. The emperor, of course, launched his last, always alone, always barefoot, always without fanfare. Lucius would have called it a sacred pause, a liminal act. And here's your strange tidbit: in at least one village legend holds that during the second night of 1,000 kites, a boy's kite was caught in a sudden downdraft and landed in a forest near a monastery. Days later, the monks returned it with a response written in gold ink in characters that glowed faintly when touched. The message read, "Keep asking." No one ever admitted writing it. Historians still argue whether it was a prank, a parable, or a fluke of chemistry. But that boy, he became a philosopher. His teachings emphasized humility, inquiry, and the value of unanswered questions. The emperor heard the story and reportedly smiled. Now you find yourself beneath a tree, strung with kite fragments, worn, faded, beautiful. Some still bear legible ink. You run your fingers along one, "Forgive me." Another, "Remember her." A third, "Is there more?" It's quiet here, a contemplative hush, the kind Lucius always sought in his experiments. You can almost feel the salt basin beneath your palms again, trembling without breeze. You wonder if it would stir now in the presence of this gentle forest of former prayers. Because that's what they are, these letters. Not data, not demands, prayers in lowercase. And that's something the emperor always understood. He never expected the moon to send back a scroll with a royal seal. He didn't want clarity. He wanted resonance. So the letters continued. So did the kites. And with time, the questions grew stranger. More specific, less selfish. One noblewoman asked the moon for guidance on her orchard. She couldn't decide between plum or apricot trees. Another, a retired general, sent a letter that read simply, "Did I do the right thing?" Some wrote about love, some about death, one about a fox that visited his house nightly and sat by the fire like it belonged. The emperor read them all. Yes, he had them collected. After each festival, the imperial kite catcher's real job title would retrieve every message that drifted back into the palace grounds. Some kites traveled miles crossing rivers and mountains to return. Others arrived torn, soot-streaked, or blank. But the emperor read them anyway. He stored them in the Moon Annex, a small circular library tucked beneath the observatory. No one else was allowed inside, but once a court painter caught a glimpse. He said the shelves weren't labeled by topic or author, but by silence. The ones that made the emperor weep were placed higher, and one shelf, he claimed, remained empty, reserved for an answer the emperor hadn't received. Yet, you sit now beside that imagined shelf, feeling the weight of what it held and what it didn't. The empty space as meaningful as the scrolls beside it. Because sometimes absence is the clearest answer. Lucius would have nodded slowly, then underlined that sentence twice. Outside, the wind is rising. Time for another letter. You fold your own kite slowly, ink your question with care, and step into the courtyard where others wait, their faces lit with hope, or grief, or just the thrill of trying. The sky is ready. You let go and watch it rise. By now, the moon letters aren't just ritual, they're legacy. They've become the soft thread stitching one generation to the next. You're standing in a modest home now. Stone floor, rice paper windows, a low brazier crackling in the corner. An old woman is guiding her granddaughter's hands over a fresh kite frame. Bamboo silk red thread. The girl fumbles. The thread snaps. She giggles, tries again. It's a scene you've seen play out in villages, cities, even palace courtyards. But here it's quiet, intimate. The grandmother says nothing about technique. Only this right, what you want heard. That's the rule now. Has been for decades. No one tells you what kind of message to send. You're not graded, not judged. The act is enough, and it's spread. Beyond the empire's borders, beyond the languages carved on the palace stones, across rivers, deserts, oceans. The practice drifts with the wind, just like the kites themselves. One mainstream historical fact, during the late Song Dynasty, foreign envoys from Korea, Japan, and even parts of Central Asia documented the festival of moonkites in their journals. Some returned home and tried to replicate it. A few succeeded. Others got tangled in trees. But the idea took root. And here's your quirky tidbit. One particularly eccentric merchant from Venice. Yes, that Venice is rumored to have brought a moonkite home after a trade visit. His neighbors laughed. His children wept when it burned in a chimney mishap. But 50 years later, his grandson founded a strange little guild in Florence, dedicated to celestial correspondence. Their emblem, a crescent moon, holding a paper scroll. Historians still argue whether this practice ever truly crossed cultures, or if those tales were just echoes shaped by nostalgia and wine. But you know how stories work. They sneak, they shimmer, they survive. You step now into a different kind of room, the Imperial Kite Workshop. No tourists, no ceremonies, just a handful of artisans bent over work tables, strewn with inkstones, pigments, brushes, and fragile spools of thread so fine it looks like captured breath. These aren't decoration pieces. They're not mass-produced. Each kite the emperor sends is handmade, often by the same 3 or 4 scribes who've been doing it for years. And they all have their quirks. One insists on painting moons with slight imperfections, a dot here, a nick there. Too perfect, and she won't trust us, he says. Another chants a line of poetry under his breath as he knots the final loop. To carry words into wind first, you must love them. A third, the youngest, is inventing a kite that unfurls in midair, one that reveals the letter only after release. It's never worked, but she keeps trying. And that, you realize, is the heart of this whole story. Not whether the moon writes back, not whether anyone's reading the messages, but the trying. The emperor understands this. Lucius would have too, because it's not the success that sanctifies the ritual. It's the intention, the attention, the effort, You watch now as a new message is prepared. The Emperor's ink is darker than usual. The brush moves slower. He's writing something long, private. The room has cleared. No one dares peek. But you see the envelope after. It's sealed with 2 characters, Hui Yin. Echo. That night he walks alone to the launch platform. The courtyard is empty. Not festival season. Not a holiday. Just a regular evening with a strange hush in the air. The moon is low, pale, watching. He releases the kite. It catches wind, instantly rises. Fast, disappears fast. He waits. Nothing returns. Of course not. You're not disappointed. Neither is he. Because this part isn't about answers. It's about bearing witness and letting yourself be witnessed. You follow him back inside. The halls of the palace are darker now than they used to be. Quieter. The Emperor walks slower. His back is more bent, but his eyes still searching. He stops at a small alcove you've never noticed before. Inside, a shelf of glass jars. Each contains a single scrap of fabric. Faded frayed, but unmistakably kite silk. You peer closer. Some hold ink-stained corners. One has a thread still attached. These came back, the Emperor says. You ask what he means. They weren't caught. He explains. They returned. On their own. Wind shift, gravity, or something else. He doesn't explain further. But you get it. Because sometimes the universe answers quietly. With fragments, with echoes, with silk carried home by rain. One jar has no label. You point. He nods. That one was my mother's. He doesn't say more. Doesn't need to. You're back now in the Moon Annex, remember? The private circular library where returned kites were kept. It's larger now, cataloged. The shelves are still arranged by silence, but they've expanded. One section is labeled Echoes Received, another Whispers Deferred, and a third unopened. You stare at that last one. It contains sealed letters the Emperor never read. Not out of apathy, but reverence. He believed some messages weren't meant for human eyes. Just transit. You ask if he ever peeked. Once he admits, it said, "Thank you." That was enough. And now it's your turn. You've made your kite. You've written your letter. You step out under a sky feathered with early stars and let your offering go. It flutters, climbs, sways, and vanishes. You don't expect a reply, but you wait anyway. Not for proof, not for logic, just for the shape of wonder. The moon doesn't respond with thunder or miracles, just stillness, just light. But that's enough. You return to the palace, though. By now the palace is quieter. The halls feel longer, the steps more solemn. The Emperor has grown older. His hair, once storm black, now shimmers with silver in the lantern glow. But he still writes. Every evening, a short letter, one line, sometimes 2. Always to the same recipient. He never names the moon, never says goddess or ancestor, or you who watch. Only leaves space at the top, the way one might for a friend they've known long enough not to explain things to anymore. Here's your historical fact. Emperors during the later dynasties often recorded dreams as official documentation, cataloged by date tone, even direction of moonlight when they woke. Some scrolls still survive tucked in jade boxes or lacquered drawers, each labeled Ye Meng, or night visions. The Emperor in your story, he started storing his letters the same way. Not for others, not for history, but for the ritual of remembering. And here's the quirky detail. One letter is nothing but the character for listen, written again and again, shrinking in size until it disappears off the edge of the paper. Scholars still argue whether it was a prayer, a message, or just an accident involving an overenthusiastic ink brush. You step now into the quietest room in the palace. It's new, or feels new. Built of old wood and open beams, No windows, no decorations, just air and quiet. They call it the echo chamber. And it's not for speech, it's for memory. This is where the emperor reads old messages aloud, to no one, or to the moon, or maybe just to himself. You join him once. He hands you a scroll, nods for you to read it. You hesitate. It's not yours. But he insists. The words are soft, plain, a list almost. The names of the trees I remember, the scent of peach blossoms in morning rain, the laughter of someone whose name I've forgotten, but not their joy. It doesn't feel like history. It feels like breath. And that, you realize, is the legacy of the letters, not declarations of greatness, not royal mandates, just reminders of being. You walk the city walls at dusk now. The emperor does too. Not every day, not always with fanfare. Sometimes alone, hooded, unrecognized. He carries a single kite folded into his sleeve, just in case. And others do the same. It's become tradition. Not formal, not enforced, but understood. On the last night of each lunar month, people climb roofs, hills, balconies. They release kites, some with messages, some blank, some painted with stars, others with nothing but a handprint. A few are made by children shaped like dragons or suns or very lopsided rabbits. One day, someone launches a kite shaped like the moon itself. Silver cloth, round and rippling. Lucius would have loved that. He'd have charted the wind, mapped the message, added a grain of salt, and a line of poetry. Then probably tied it all to a feather and declared it an experiment. Historians still argue whether this mass kite-sending ritual ever truly became official. Some call it folklore. Others say there were edicts carved into temple stones. No one agrees. No one has to. Because the ritual outlived the records. That's the thing about stories woven into habit. They don't need paper. They drift, attach themselves to thread and time, and settle into bone. You're back now with the emperor in his chamber. He's older. His hands tremble slightly as he folds his next kite. He doesn't ask for help. You watch quietly as he paints one stroke a spiral and writes a single line, "If you hear me hum." Then he smiles. "Not because I expect it," he says, "but because I believe in trying." That evening, he climbs the tower steps one last time. No ceremony, just moonlight. He releases the kite. It wobbles, dips, and then catches wind. You both watch it rise. And for the briefest moment, the silk hums. A low, fluttering sound. Maybe it's wind. Maybe not. He doesn't say anything, just watches until it vanishes into stars. Later that night, he places the ink brush down for the final time, not with sadness, just peace. The moon is high, the room is still. You step outside, and for the first time you write your own letter. Fold it, tie it to thread, and wait for wind, not for answers, but for the rhythm of a ritual that's lasted lifetimes. And maybe, just maybe, for that soft hum that says yes. The hum becomes memory almost before you can name it. It echoes only once, then disappears like breath on glass. Still, you hold it in your chest, like a stone warmed by sun, quiet, private, and heavier than you expect. The emperor is not seen the next day, nor the day after. The palace gates remain open, the routine unbroken, but the inner corridors feel paused, as if the breath of the place is being held, waiting for something to settle. No decree is issued, no bells are rung, but people begin to walk differently, slower, with more intention. A boy delivers water to the kitchens and bows to the sky before he enters. A gardener pauses mid-prune to whisper something into the breeze. Even the guards hum under their breath, the same small tune you've heard echoing from the tower steps. The emperor, when he does return to public view, has changed nothing about his appearance. But you can tell. There's a stillness to him now that isn't silence. It's completion. He holds no scrolls, carries no kites, but every step he takes feels like punctuation, a story nearing its final chapter. You follow him to the pavilion one evening, the same one where he first launched letters as a young, ambitious ruler with more questions than advisors. He doesn't sit, doesn't speak. He simply stares at the moon. And when you glance at his hands, you notice they are empty. That's the historical moment. Because here's your historical fact. Toward the end of certain emperors' reigns, particularly in China's Song and Ming dynasties, it became common for them to relinquish rituals they had once obsessively upheld, not out of forgetfulness, but reverence, to let the act become memory, to trust it had taken root. And your fringe detail. Some historians have found court records of mysterious blank scrolls sent to minor officials in the outer provinces. Messages with no writing. Just wax seals folded precisely 7 times. Interpretations vary, but one theory. They weren't messages from the emperor. They were messages to the moon, rerouted. Historians still argue whether these scrolls had secret meanings, invisible inks, or were simply political distractions cloaked in ceremony. But those who lived closest to the emperor believed one thing: they were gifts. You stand beside him, and you understand now he's done writing. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because some messages finish themselves. And just as you think that you notice something fluttering above, it's not a kite. Not exactly. It's a bird. But one you don't recognize, slender silver-feathered wings edged with black. It dips once, twice, then glides overhead like it's circling something only it can see. Then it's gone. The emperor doesn't look up, but you see the corner of his mouth lift slightly. He's been expecting it. You walk together through the inner garden. Peach blossoms are blooming too early for the season, and beneath one tree, tucked into the crook of its roots, lies a folded piece of paper. You pick it up, unfold it. There is no writing, just an inked spiral, and the impression of a feather pressed into the page as if by accident. You place it back gently, as if it might grow. That evening, the emperor asks for a single bowl of soup. Not ceremonial, just his favorite sweet lotus with ginger. He eats half, sets the bowl aside, then says simply, "Tomorrow." And you know. There are no drums at dawn, no parade, just the sound of soft sweeping and the clink of teacups. And when the palace awakes fully, the emperor has gone, not vanished, not stolen away, just gone. His room is undisturbed, his sandals placed neatly by the door, a window left open, a breeze stirring one final page on the writing desk. You approach it carefully, heart knocking against your ribs like a restless bird. It's not a letter. It's not even addressed. It's a list. Things he never sent. Ideas he never used. Half lines. Broken rhymes. One simply reads, "A kite made of silence. You don't cry? Not yet. Instead, you place your hand over the list and breathe. The staff hold quiet mourning. No funeral? Only a feast. Plates of the emperor's favorite foods. Toasts spoken with gentle humor. Stories shared that no historian will ever hear, but that matter more than ink. And after the feast, the letters are read. Not the emperor's letters. The ones others wrote back. Because yes, people had sent replies. Most never reached him. The skies don't return mail. But the people had written anyway, and the palace had kept them. Scrolls tied with string, folded sheets tucked into lanterns, fragments of poetry inked on the backs of receipts. They're all here, and tonight you read them aloud, to the air, to the memory, to the emperor who believed the moon might answer if spoken to kindly enough. One reads, "You taught me to believe in listening." Another, "My father wrote letters to the sky. I write them now for him." And another no reply needed. Just needed to be heard. The room is still. And in that stillness, you feel it. The hum again. Not a sound this time. A pulse? A presence? Something like moonlight made tangible. The kind of thing that can't be numbered, can't be shelved, can't even be fully described, but can be remembered. And that more than anything else was the point. The moon doesn't rise with drama tonight. It climbs gently, like it knows it's being watched. You stand in the inner courtyard alone, but not lonely breathing. In the scent of jasmine and old paper, there's a hush over everything. Not silence, but something deeper. Reverence, maybe, or memory disguised as quiet. You walk the paths the emperor once favored, past the fish pond where he fed the same 3 koi for 20 years, past the window ledge where he once tried to balance a teacup and a falcon feather and called it balance in metaphor, past the tiny door in the garden wall no one's ever seen opened. You think of knocking, but decide against it. There's one last place you haven't gone, the archive. You push open the heavy doors, and the air inside smells of cedar smoke and something floral like dried plum blossoms. The room is lined with scrolls stacked and bound, cataloged with obsessive care, and the occasional brushstroke of rebellion. Some are wrapped in string made from dyed silk. Some have seals shaped like animals that don't exist. One is labeled simply, "Don't." You ignore the obvious ones. You've learned enough from Lucius, from the emperor, from the quiet flutter of pages that never wanted an audience. You look instead for the unsorted, and you find it. A box with no label. Inside kites, dozens of them, paper and bamboo silk, and thread feathers and gold. Each one is different. Some are tiny palm-sized, like toys. Others stretch taller than a man, their wings curved like smiles. But none are complete. They are fragments, experiments, failures, or maybe beginnings. You unroll one. The spine is cracked, the fabric brittle. But in the center, drawn in charcoal, is a spiral wrapped in text so fine it looks like wind. You recognize the handwriting. Lucius. Somehow again, he's left something behind. The kite's body is inscribed with questions, not messages. Does silence echo differently at altitude? What shape is longing in thin air? Can stillness be measured in flight? They're not rhetorical. They're waiting. You spend hours there not reading, but feeling. Each kite holds a piece of thought too unruly for numbers, too tender for systems. And maybe that's why they were never flown. Because some messages aren't meant to arrive. They're meant to rise. You take one gently, reverently, and step outside. There's no wind, no fanfare, just the moon. Watching. You lift the kite slowly. It trembles, then steadies, then lifts. Just enough to clear your head, then higher. You don't force it. You just hold the string. Let it pull. And in that moment, you remember one final historical fact. There's evidence in Chinese court records, specifically during the Han Dynasty, that officials experimented with flying notes, paper tied to lightweight frames meant to carry messages over walls or rivers. Some were military, some ceremonial. But at least one emperor, anonymous, unnamed, was said to send poetry to the stars. A fringe scholar in the 1920s claimed to have found a reference to a letter of gratitude sent skyward. No recipient listed, no return expected. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor or mythology, a fantasy of communication unbound by reply. But you're not arguing. You're here, and the kite is flying. The string hums in your hand like a tuning fork. You could swear it's vibrating with words. And not yours, not Lucius's, not the emperor's, but theirs. The ones who wrote back, the ones who waited, the ones who hoped. Because that's what libraries are too, aren't they? Collections of longing, of questions, of letters to the moon. You tie the kite string to the garden gate and leave it flying. Tomorrow, someone else will see it. Maybe they'll wonder who sent it. Maybe they'll write something in return. You don't need to know. You walk the outer walls as dawn begins to gather soft, slow the color of breath against frost. And there, tucked into the stone, you find a feather. It's not black like before, not ash or crow or charcoal. It's white, almost translucent. It looks like a whisper. You place it in your pocket without a word, because some gifts arrive without explanation. And that's enough. You take one final look at the garden, at the rooftops, at the sky with its new sun, and you feel it again, that hum. But this time, it's not from a basin, not from salt or string or silence. It's from you. You're humming, without meaning to, a tune you don't know but recognize. And that's how it begins again. Not with a plan, not with a system, but with one note, held softly, willing to rise. The hum stays with you through the day, not loud, not distracting, just there, like something tucked behind your heartbeat, softly threading itself through the mundane. You move through the world a little differently now. Your pace slows. You linger at windows longer. You begin to notice how shadows fall on pages, how dust twirls in shafts of afternoon light, how the wind plays with leaves like it's choosing which message to carry next. You visit the little brick library again. It's quieter this time, fewer people, fewer distractions. You drift toward the shelves like a moth toward an unread sentence, and there, near section 133.1, nestled between folklore of spirits and superstition through the ages, is the gap, still unfilled, still waiting. You slide Lucius's final note out of your coat pocket. You read it again, not because you've forgotten the words, but because something about reading it in this space feels like a small ritual. The soul may be unclassified, but it is never lost. You don't place it on the shelf. You just hold it. Let it warm in your palm like a stone smoothed by memory. Then you walk to the reference desk. There's a girl behind the counter, about 17, chewing on the end of a pencil and reading a manga volume with a cover she's tried and failed to hide behind a dictionary. You place the note on the counter. This might belong in 398.221. You whisper, or nowhere. She glances at it, blinks and nods. Cool. And that's it. You leave without explaining, because some things don't need explaining. Later, you find yourself sitting at the edge of a hill, watching a kite fly. Not yours. Someone else's. It's blue with a sun stitched into its belly and tails made of crumpled receipts. It wobbles like it's still deciding whether it wants to stay. You smile, because suddenly you see it all clearly. Lucius's scales, the salt, the spirals, the paper prayers, the feather that wasn't from any bird you'd seen. It wasn't about weight. It wasn't even about measurement. It was about motion, about letting things rise when they're ready and fall gently when they're done. You remember how this all started? A question, or maybe a whisper of a question dressed up in symbols and science and a bit too much string. Can a soul be measured? You still don't have the answer, but you've learned this. The act of asking earnestly, patiently, with open hands and a hopeful heart is what keeps the mystery intact. It's what makes you human. It's what ties you, however briefly, to something beyond yourself. And that really is enough. So you hum again. Just one note. And it echoes softly, then fades. Now the wind down begins. Let the sky soften above you the color of powdered indigo and quiet thought. The kite still floats lightly, steadily, as if it knows you're still watching. Still wondering, still awake, just a little longer. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath deepen. Let the images settle like dust in a sunbeam. Scrolls and shelves, gardens and ink laughter tucked into the margins of ancient pages. The hush of 1,000 libraries, each one built on hope. The flutter of a kite string just before dawn. The weightless promise of unanswered questions. Let all of that rest with you now. There is nothing more to do tonight. No more names to remember. No more systems to solve. You are already part of the archive, already included in the story. You walked the halls. You asked the questions. You listened. And that listening, that stillness, is its own kind of answer. Now drift. Wherever you are, however your night unfolds, may your thoughts find peace and your dreams fly lightly. The shelves are still there. The stars are still listening. And Lucius, he's still humming. Somewhere. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Maybe by now you've already drifted off to sleep, and if so, we hope this story brought you peace of mind and helped you rest a little easier. Deep sleep makes life better, and we're truly happy to be part of that. Until next time, sweet dreams.